Our journey doesn't begin with a celebration, it begins with a risk. Leaving the last, safe warmth behind, we step out onto the frozen highway of the Ice Age. We are searching for more than just survival, we are searching for solid ground, a new home, and a fighting chance at a future. Chapter 6. The Frozen Highway. The last exit. The morning we left the high-rise did not offer a majestic sunrise, only a cold, crystalline clarity that made the brutal reality of the Ice Age stark and unforgiving. The temperature had stabilized, hovering at a dangerous 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind had not yet returned to tear at our layers. It was a reprieve, not a blessing. 24 souls stood ready, bundled into every layer of scavenged dry wool and quilted cotton we possessed, our breaths pluming like white smoke signals of life against the silent frozen death of New York. The atmosphere in the 16th floor core was taut, humming with fear and necessity. The air of mourning over Mrs. Henderson's sacrifice still hung thick, a silent promise to make her death count. Brody moved through the final preparations, with the quiet intensity of a man closing a complex circuit. He and Charles, the engineer, had worked through the night, dismantling the salvaged speedboat and crucial pieces of furniture to construct 2 highly specialized sleds. They were low-slung, sturdy frames built from thick wooden doors, reinforced by metal strips scavenged from appliance carcasses, and designed to slide over the unpredictable texture of the frozen floodwater. The supplies were organized with military precision. The food sled, manned by Charles, Travis, and 2 of the younger, stronger men, bore the brunt of their future. The remaining stacks of MREs, canned food, the ramen, the seeds, and most critically, the propane tanks. The second sled held the 4 large propane tanks that represented our heat timer, along with tents, tarps, and more coverings. Kyle, whose leg was braced and bandaged, and Mr. Davies, whose age and chronic cough made the continuous walk impossible, were to sit on the sled should they get tired. Brody and the 4 remaining strongest men in our group were to pull it. But before the resources were arranged on the sled, they were first lowered to the frozen ice below. I, Malika, Sarah, and the other women were lowered first with a rope harness, followed by the children, then Mr. Davies and Kyle. The sleds and supplies came next, which we quickly started arranging. Brody was the last to climb down from the building, unhooking the rope so that we could use it some other time. The final descent down the building had been the slow, most agonizing part. With 24 people and 2 heavily loaded sleds, each being pulled by 2 men at a time, we started our journey. The apartment that had been our sanctuary and protection slowly faded in the distance. By around midday, something I started believing I'd never lay eyes on showed through the clouds. The midday sun, a weak, indifferent silver disk above them. The expedition stood still, watching it for a moment. We were standing on what was once the pavement of a massive intersection, now covered in a 3-foot layer of petrified gray-blue ice. Beneath that ice lay frozen cars, frozen buses, and the silent, drowned secrets of the city. Malika chuckles as she looks down at something below her feet. "What is it?" I ask her. She points and my eyes land on a frozen 6-pack of soda and I groan. I imagined tasting the sweet purple berry juice. "How far do you think it is?" she asked me, looking at the small wrench in her hands. "I don't know, 4 feet maybe?" I told her, and she groans. "Secure the ropes," Brody tells his partner, pulling the lead harness of the food sled over his shoulders. We move northwest. Our pace is set by the slowest walker. No one falls behind. If you fall and cannot rise immediately, signal, but do not stop the group. The great trudge begins. The hours that followed were a baptism of cold and exhaustion. The ice surface was uneven, treacherous, and strewn with frozen debris, splintered wood, twisted metal, and the occasional macabre sight of a frozen rooftop garden or a floating sign encased in the glacier. Worst of all were the frozen humans, eyes wide, stuck in the ice for what could be 100 years. The sleds were heavy, resisting the pull, their runners occasionally catching on submerged wreckage, with an awful scraping groan that sounded like the city protesting our escape. I found myself flanking Brody, positioned between the 2 sleds. My nursing expertise was now secondary to the need for vigilance. My job was to monitor the faces of the walkers, checking for the telltale white patches of frostbite, the slack jaw of hypothermia, or the desperate fatigue that could lead to a stumble. Brody and Jackson, one of the strong men, harnessed to the propane sled, struggled with the weight and the shifting ice, often slipping and relying on the sharp, rapid intervention of other people around them. 500 miles, Travis gasped as he stopped, his breath steaming violently in the air. "This is ridiculous. This is how the Donner Party felt," he said after we made our final stop for the day. "The Donner Party was starving and eating each other," Malika retorted, handing him a bottle of water that was nestled in her jacket. "We have ramen and soup, and Brody hasn't looked at anyone like a main course yet. Rest, you did well today. Very sexy how you handled the sled, babe." Her voice, low and only reserved for Travis. The silence of the frozen city was absolute. There were no sirens, no traffic, no voices, only the crunch of our boots, the sounds of people moving around, and the vast, unsettling sound of the wind moving over the frozen surface. The buildings that lined the avenue, once symbols of commerce and progress, were now frozen, hollowed-out monuments to a forgotten era, their lower 12 floors encased in ice. We were walking on a glacier of broken civilization. The siren call of luxury. After catching our breaths, Brody consulted his salvaged map, comparing it to the visible landmarks, a tall, slender tower that had clearly been a high-end luxury residential building. "We can go and check out this building," Brody announced, gesturing toward the gleaming granite-faced tower. "It's structurally sound. Above the frozen waterline, we break the former rules of decency and raid." The danger was immense. The cold made every minute of activity costly. Raiding required energy that should be conserved. But Brody's reasoning was sound. Our clothing was not enough. The wool was heavy, chafing, and hard to dry once wet. We needed modern, light, high-performance winter gear, items that only a luxury apartment building would contain. The building was a temple of wealth, a fortress that had survived the initial flood due to its sheer height. 30 floors still stood above the frozen ice. The broken windows didn't show any sign of life, but the height meant most of the things there must have been untouched by water. "Charles, secure the perimeter and monitor the thermal fluctuations," Brody commanded. "Jade, Malika, and everyone else, you're with me." We move fast. We target closets and kitchens. We need down jackets, ski gear, and preserved goods. We moved inside the building through a large balcony. The apartment was a cavern of silent, dark marble and glass. The silence here was different. It was the expectant hush of preserved wealth. The scent of mold and old cologne hung heavy in the air. We walked past it, seeing enough water damage and things swept away. Everything on this floor had been submerged in water for a good amount of time before the water levels dropped. The elevator was, predictably, dead, so we took the stairwell, deciding to tackle the 16th floors and above. We started ascending, moving from floor to floor, kicking in doors with brutal efficiency. "Focus on the high floors," Brody instructed, his voice low and urgent. They had the most expensive wardrobes. Get multiple layers of anything synthetic, lightweight, and water-resistant. The apartments were pristine, time capsules of luxury frozen in place. We found walk-in closets packed with designer clothes, cashmere sweaters, leather jackets, and, crucially, high-end technical ski and mountaineering gear, lightweight down, Gore-Tex shells, and thermal base layers. In a majority of the apartments, we found the owners, frozen where they had huddled around a fireplace for warmth. I worked with a ruthless efficiency, emptying drawers and closets into large duffel bags. The weight of the guilt, raiding the possessions of people who were likely dead, was secondary to the cold, hard logic of survival. In one massive, mirrored closet, I found a cache of brand-new, vacuum-sealed expedition-grade thermal sleeping bags. It was a massive haul, enough for everyone to sleep warmly, reducing our reliance on the gas heater during the night. Brody and his team, meanwhile, focused on the pantries and liquor cabinets. The goal was high-calorie, high-proof sustenance. They found sealed bags of dried pasta, expensive olive oils, concentrated dried fruits, sugar, tea, and high-proof vodka, which could be used as a disinfectant or a quick internal hit of heat. "This turned out better than I expected," Brody muttered, tossing a bag of freeze-dried gourmet coffee into a bag. "We'll be able to move faster if we're not carrying 20 pounds of damp wool." Shelter and shared warmth. After an hour of frantic scavenging, the group retreated, hauling out 10 heavy duffel bags of crucial supplies. The sleds, parked near the entrance, were quickly reloaded, the new weight distributed with care. The scavenged apartment building was our shelter for the night. Brody chose a large, south-facing common room on the 20th floor. I quickly deployed the newly acquired sleeping bags, lining the floor and sealing the room against the night cold, and laying the wool blankets as a base. The propane heater, brought up by Charles and Travis, was lit, its red glow bathing the exhausted faces of the survivors. The food was cooked with some of the scavenged spices and oil, providing a rich, satisfying meal that settled the gnawing hunger. The mood was one of cautious triumph. We had survived the first day, and we were warmer and better supplied than we had been in weeks. As the others settled down for a long, necessary rest, Brody and I retreated to a dark, unused office area nearby to discuss the inventory. "The hall is critical," Brody reported, checking the gas pressure one last time. "We have enough thermal layering to cut our fuel consumption in the main room by 40% during the night. The sleeping bags are a game changer. We can stretch the propane tanks to nearly 8 weeks now, maybe more, if we are absolutely ruthless." "And the food?" I asked, shivering slightly despite the internal warmth of the room. "High calorie density. Enough to increase the rations slightly for the next 10 days, giving us the energy we need for the hardest phase of the journey. We leave at first light, no excuses. We cannot afford the wind." We finished the inventory, the small sound of my pen scratching on a salvaged notepad the only noise. When the task was complete, Brody simply turned off the flashlight. The dark enveloped us, quiet and warm. "Come here, Jade," he murmured. I moved into his embrace. We didn't need the elaborate performance of earlier nights. The exhaustion was too profound, the bond too absolute. We found the sleeping bag I had set aside for us in the corner, a soft, down-filled sanctuary. We lay together, fully clothed except for our outer coats, sharing the heat of the bag. He rested his chin on the crown of my head, and I inhaled the clean, faint scent of the cold and the propane that clung to him. 500 miles, I whispered into the dark. 500 miles, he confirmed. But we're warmer now, we're moving, and we have enough to get us through the most dangerous part of the walk. We are closer to the farm than we were 24 hours ago. We made it through the day, I sighed, feeling the tension finally drain from my body. We'll make it through tomorrow. He squeezed me tight, a promise in the gesture. The heat of our bodies and the downlining of the bag made a perfect, fragile haven. "Sleep now, Jade," Brody commanded, his voice a low, rough anchor in the cold, vast dark. We have an ice age to walk through, and in the silence of the frozen city, I finally did. Chapter 7. The 500-mile walk. The monotony of the glacial road. The following morning, we left the luxury apartment building, and our journey began not with grand adventure or excitement, but with monotonous, bone-aching exhaustion. Leaving the towering frozen husk of New York City behind was a psychological break, but the landscape that followed, the frozen plains of New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania, offered no relief. The days blurred into an agonizing cycle of walking, resting, setting up camp, taking down camp, and pulling, defined by the rhythm of the sled runners and the constant, demanding cold. The temperature rarely rose above 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Every breath was a risk. Every exposed patch of skin an invitation to permanent injury. Brody, who walked point, maintained a brutal discipline, enforcing 2-hour shifts for the pullers and mandatory thermal checks every time the column stopped. The two sleds, laden with the necessities of survival, canned beans, MREs, and the priceless gas tanks, dictated our pace. The men rotated religiously. Travis, Charles, Brody, and the others, their shoulders hunched against the harnesses, their muscles screaming from the exertion. Travis, despite his initial complaints, channeled his nervous energy into brute force. Charles proved steady, using his analytical mind to help Brody anticipate terrain changes beneath the opaque, frozen surface. I walked constantly, a moving sentry, my focus narrowed to the faces of the walkers. The new, high-tech scavenged clothing from the luxury apartment was a lifesaver, but it couldn't stop the insidious creeping of the cold. I watched for the subtle discoloration around cheeks, nose tips, and fingers, the white flag of frostbite, signaling a need for an immediate dose of high-proof vodka or a frantic rub-down with heated hands. The children, Ben and Lily, were the most difficult to manage, yet the most essential to keep alive. They had quickly settled into a routine of alternating movement and rest, their small bodies quickly exhausting their thermal reserves. They would walk for 45 minutes, heads bowed against the cold, their parents tethered to them by rope harnesses to prevent a slip. Then, they would retreat to the supply sled, burrowing deep into the down sleeping bags, their rest timed precisely to maximize their walking output while minimizing the puller's load. Their survival was the most visible measure of the group's success. The landscape itself was a cruel masterpiece of destruction. We traveled predominantly along the frozen expanse of the interstate highways, the massive sheets of ice proving smoother than the broken, choked back roads. The highway signs, broken and frozen partially in ice, pointed to cities that no longer existed in any meaningful way. Shadows of buildings remained. We looked out for the telltale sign of life whenever we passed a city, a sign of smoke in the distance coming from a building, but we saw none. The few isolated cars we passed were sealed entirely in ice, their occupants long gone or entombed inside them. The most unnerving aspect was the silence. The world was dead. There were no animals, no birds, no distant echoes of human activity. The absence of sound, only the cold, brittle white of snow and ice, was so profound it became a physical pressure, emphasizing our extreme isolation. We were 24 whispers against the cold vacuum of the Ice Age. Scavenging the asphalt coast, as the expedition pushed deeper into Pennsylvania, our scavenging shifted from opportunistic raids to calculated supply runs. The easy pickings of the frozen city were over. Now, we hunted for the necessities that lined the defunct arteries of commerce. Gas stations and truck stops became our main targets. These structures, built low and sturdy, were less likely to have suffered catastrophic collapse than the skyscrapers. More importantly, they were prime locations for fuel and high-calorie industrial food. We even managed to find more gas tanks, which allowed us to swap out our almost empty ones. Brody, Charles, and Travis would lead small, three-man scouting teams, moving ahead of the main column to breach and secure a target building. One successful raid on a large, deserted roadside warehouse yielded a treasure trove: stacks of shrink-wrapped, insulated delivery blankets, perfect for sled padding and extra bedding, and, critically, rolls of heavy-duty industrial plastic sheeting. Charles immediately recognized its value, suggesting they use it to create a secondary, wind-proof barrier around our propane heaters at night, significantly cutting heat loss. "This is the material of a future shelter," Brody murmured, inspecting the plastic. "We'll use it to build our first permanent structure in Ohio." The finds were not always easy. During a run into a small frozen town off the main highway, they found a grocery store largely intact. However, the contents were a nightmare of shattered glass and frozen, useless mush. The flash freeze had burst all the water-based cans and liquids, rendering most of the food spoiled or locked into impenetrable blocks of ice. The energy spent clearing the ice was rarely worth the caloric return. The scarcity of other human life was confirmed with chilling regularity. We never saw tracks outside our own. The few frozen figures we encountered, a family huddled in a roadside diner, a man sitting rigidly behind the wheel of a tractor, were poignant, terrifying reminders of the flash freeze's sudden lethality. The sheer emptiness of the American landscape swallowed our fears whole. But one thing we did notice, however, is that as we went deeper inland, frozen water that used to cover floors upon floors of building had now reduced to a few feet high. We could see single-story buildings half submerged in cold, unforgiving blocks of ice. We raided whenever we found a chance. Malika struggled most with the moral complexity of the scavenge. "We are walking into these people's final moments, Jade," she confessed one night, huddled by the heater. "We are raiding their ghosts. We are taking resources they can no longer use to guarantee a future they can no longer have," I responded, adopting Brody's stark, functional logic. "Our guilt is the price of our survival, Malika. We carry it, but we don't let it stop us." The toll in the Covenant, the physical toll, was immense. Every member of the expedition suffered constantly, but the determination held. The acquired down gear was constantly monitored, and the precious propane was rationed with the meticulous precision of a heart surgeon. Kyle proved far more determined than his injuries suggested. Though he spent the majority of the days sitting stiffly on the sled, he insisted on moving the final 50 yards before we made camp, pushing off with his cane and dragging his braced leg through the snow. He became a living symbol of willpower, his determination shaming any able-bodied person who complained of fatigue. Mr. Davies, despite his chronic cough, used his hands, not his legs. He was meticulous in preparing the kindling for the morning fire, and was the group's designated soup maker, using his limited mobility to stir the rations while huddled by the propane. The core relationship between Brody and me deepened under the relentless pressure. Our partnership was forged in the fire of shared exhaustion and shared authority. Our leadership, though not formally appointed, was unified, presenting an unshakable front to the group. In the small, private warmth of our down cocoon, the outside world melted away. Our intimacy was a sanctuary, a brief, profound escape into the raw, living present. The physical closeness was not merely comfort, it was a reaffirmation of the future we were pulling the sleds toward. "Did you map out the river approach?" I would murmur, my hand tracing the cold, hard muscle of his back. "Confirmed," he'd whisper back, his breath warm against my hair. We moved directly south, to hit the narrowest crossing point. "I think we are doing good under the circumstances." There were no elaborate declarations, only constant, quiet trust. He shared with me the full, terrifying inventory of our resources, the exact GPS coordinates of our route, and the projected collapse date of our propane supply. I shared the status of the injured, the mood of the team, and the depth of our physical depletion. We were two halves of the command circuit, functioning perfectly in the deep dark. Crossing the final barriers. As the weeks bled past the 20-day mark, the topography became the central enemy. The Appalachian foothills presented steep, frozen inclines, and terrifying sudden descents. The sleds had to be pulled in tandem, often requiring every able-bodied person to haul a single rope up a slope, the snow sometimes deep enough to require snowshoes, which, thankfully, we had scavenged from a sporting goods store earlier in our journey. The major river crossings, the Delaware and the Susquehanna, were immense, daunting spectacles of frozen power. They were miles wide, their surfaces a churning, chaotic expanse of broken ice flows that had frozen into a solid, impenetrable mass. The constant risk was falling through an unseen fissure, or slipping on the sharp, broken edges. Brody's engineering instincts were their only guide, navigating the most stable-looking pathways far from the banks where the ice was weakest. The fear during these crossings was absolute, freezing movement and thought. But the knowledge that every step across the ice was a step closer to Ohio kept us moving. it was too late to think of New York and the relative safety we had from the elements. We were too far gone now. On the 24th day, Brody announced their final target, the Ohio River, the last massive frozen barrier between us and the state line. We reached it at the confluence of two smaller tributaries, where the ice surface was deceptively smooth with little protrusions. We moved with the desperate speed of a group near collapse, pushing through the final crossing over the vast, white, frozen expanse of the river. The effort was immense, requiring every man, woman, and even the older boy, Ben, to push or pull the sleds up the final high bank. Ohio, the promised ground. The moment we crested the final embankment, the collective, grinding effort of the past weeks culminated in a single, freezing moment of silence. Brody stood at the top, his chest heaving, his face caked in ice and snow. He looked down at the GPS coordinates on his battery-powered device, comparing them to the desolate, rolling landscape that stretched out before us. He slowly pulled his scarf down, his lips cracked and white. "We stop for the night," he commanded, his voice raw with exhaustion. We made it. A profound silence fell over the column. Exhaustion was too complete for immediate celebration. Disbelief was mixed in our emotions too. We started this journey not knowing if we would make it, and we did. Sarah sank to her knees, pulling her children close, covering them in a protective shield of coats. Travis just leaned against the food sled, his head bowed, the steam rising off his bottle of water he is sipping from, and pulled Malika closer, giving her a kiss. Brody walked back to me, his gait unsteady, and pulled me into an icy, crushing embrace. "The satellite data was right, Jade," he whispered into my hood, his voice thick with emotion. "We're here. We crossed the line. We are finally in Ohio." He surveyed the landscape, a vast, frozen expanse of rolling hills, now covered in a uniform layer of heavy, packed snow. When we entered a gas station convenience store, the nearest building, we noticed the frozen ice was about a foot deep in places, easily distinguishable from the 30-foot vertical glacier we had just left. Beneath the snow, the earth was waiting. That night, as we made camp in the convenience store, the mood was relaxed and optimistic. The exhaustion was still there, the cold was still brutal, but for the first time in nearly a month, the immense weight of the journey had lifted, replaced by the crushing, terrifying realization of the work that lay ahead: survival on the land. Chapter 8. The Cold Engine. The first morning on promised ground, the low, silver light of the Ohio dawn revealed a landscape dramatically different from the brutal, vertical glacier of New York. We had made camp inside a sturdy but cramped gas station convenience store nestled on the outskirts of what was once a sprawling town. The mood, though heavy with exhaustion, was buoyant. We had beaten the clock. We had beaten the distance. But the relief was short-lived. The cold was still constant, and the reality of lacking an adequate, permanent shelter weighed on us. Now that we had reached the target zone, the next critical step had to be executed immediately: finding the farm and establishing a permanent base. Brody, Charles, and I volunteered for the reconnaissance. We were the best trio for the job, and our collective skills, my knowledge of the farm's location, Brody's navigation, and Charles's understanding of structural integrity, were essential. We packed light, high-proof alcohol, emergency rations, specialized tools, and Brody's precious GPS and binoculars. "We'll take the food sled," Brody announced, strapping on his thermal pack. "We just empty it, carry only our supplies, and we can haul back anything crucial we find." We left the convenience store just as the main group was stirring, the low hiss of the propane heater a promise of warmth for our return. The convenience store food wasn't all destroyed. It held some soda cans and junk food, like chips, cookies, and beef jelly, that still tasted good, once defrosted. Malika, now the undisputed second-in-command of the main group, was left in charge of maintaining security and rationing the morning meal. We planned to be back by tomorrow afternoon, if possible. The trek to the past. The landscape of rural Ohio was defined by vast, rolling fields, frozen solid beneath heavy snow. The ice, unlike the treacherous, jagged glacier of New York, was primarily confined to the lowlands and drainage areas. We walked mainly on frozen, packed earth, making the sled pull significantly easier. The journey to the farm took 7 hours of relentless movement. Brody navigated using old satellite imagery stored on his device and my childhood memories, tracing frozen county roads that were now indistinguishable from the fields we crossed. The buildings we passed were single-story affairs: frozen barns, collapsed silos, and abandoned ranch houses, all sitting heavily in the snow, their lower sections encased in thick, unforgiving ice. The destruction here was less spectacular than in the city, but more insidious: the slow, choking death of the infrastructure. As we crested a final, snow-covered hill, I saw it: the Blackwood family farm. The sight was a crushing blow, striking harder than any physical cold. I had carried the image of this place, my planned sanctuary, the foundation of our future, in my heart for weeks. What I saw was a ruin, The old farmhouse, built by my great-great-grandfather, had been neglected long before the reset. The floodwaters, minimal as they were in Ohio, had been unkind. The house sat low in a slight valley, and the foot of standing water the satellite detected had flooded the entire ground floor. The subsequent flash freeze had turned the interior into a shell of fractured plaster and burst pipes. The porch was listing badly, its foundation compromised by the freeze-thaw cycle of the initial flood. The roof, already needing repair, had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow. "Oh, Jade," Charles murmured, sensing my sudden, utter devastation. It wasn't a secret in our group how much I viewed this farm as sanctuary. I walked toward the house slowly, Brody moving beside me, his hand settling heavily on my shoulder. The barn was worse. A huge, rotting skeleton of wood, its south wall completely torn away by the frozen wind, its interior filled with massive snowdrifts. We forced open the farmhouse door, which was swollen and warped with ice. The air inside was frigid, still holding the exact temperature of the outside. The ground floor was a disaster. Furniture was overturned. Mold, now frozen and ice-layered, was visible everywhere, and the deep, pervasive cold had fractured the stove and the small furnace. "It's structurally compromised," Charles stated, his voice heavy with professional finality. "Even if we could thaw it out, the foundation is gone. We'd be pouring all our remaining fuel into a lost cause. The risk of collapse or chronic sickness from the mold is too high." The words were logical, but they felt like a cruel dismissal of my final hope. I looked at the cracked mantelpiece, the place where my parents' photos used to sit, now covered in dust and ice. The planned future of tilling the land, of simple survival, evaporated into the cold air. Brody pulled me close, resting his bearded face against the top of my hood. "I'm sorry, Jade. The land is good. The structure is not." He held me until the first wave of crushing grief passed, then his focus sharpened. Despair was a luxury they couldn't afford. The engineer's pivot. Brody immediately pulled out his tools, ignoring the wreck of the farmhouse. He needed to find a replacement base, and fast. "The satellite data didn't just give me the water level," Brody explained, pulling a thin, leather-bound book from his thermal pack. "It also gave me topography and infrastructure density. I found this map in the convenience store. It's an old county survey map of this region, predating most of the modern suburban sprawl." The map was fragile, yellowed paper but remarkably detailed. Brody spread it out carefully on the frozen hood of the sled, anchoring the corners with tools. He tapped the farm's location, then drew a large, protective circle around it. "The farm is out, and so are the other neighboring ones. From what I could see when we were coming here, this area had been long abandoned before the reset. The houses are not structurally sound considering the damage they took from the weather. We need a structure with superior construction, built to withstand higher stresses," he muttered, his mind already whirring past the emotional setback. Charles leaned in, his engineer's eye quickly drawn to the map's markings. "Look at the utility lines, Brody. There are heavy industrial lines here, feeding a location about 5 miles northeast of the farm." Brody's gloved finger traced the thick blue lines on the ancient map. The symbol at the terminus was a small, unfamiliar blocky drawing. "That's the old Wharton Consolidated School," I supplied, recognizing the name. "It's closed now, used to serve several rural districts. It was built in the 1950s, concrete and brick. They built things to last then." Brody didn't hesitate. He looked further up the line, past the school. A small, hatched symbol marked the side of a deep ravine. "And this?" Brody said, his voice dropping in excitement, looking at Charles for confirmation. Charles' eyes lit up. "The Wharton coal mine." I wrinkle my brow. "That's long abandoned. My family was one of the last people to abandon this area, and our power didn't come from there. When I was a kid, there were only 3 students in our class, 10 in the whole school." I smiled at the old memory, which brought tears to my eyes again. Brody rubbed my back, and after a few seconds of silence, Charles continued. "But look at the power diagram. The school was built right next to a dedicated, localized power station. It's a small, internal coal-fired generator. If the utility was decentralized, this might be recoverable. The school was built on higher ground. I think it might be a good place," I added, my memory of the upward climb I took every morning when I was a kid giving me a new sense of hope. The realization hit us with the force of a sudden thaw, heat, and power. Not propane gas, which was finite and difficult to haul, but the potential for reliable, renewable power from a buried, stable source of fuel, coal. The school suddenly transformed from a simple shelter into a fortress of long-term survival. "We move now," Brody commanded, already folding the map. "Charles, you and I prep the path. Jade, you navigate." The final approach, the 5-mile trek back to the main group, had everyone surprised at our arrival in the dark. "What happened?" Kyle asked. I shake my head, and it was Brody who answered. "The farm was a non-starter. But we found something else, he said. I release a breath. Something better, I added. The final push to the school in the morning with the whole group was fueled by this new, urgent hope, all of it directed onto the frozen tracks leading northeast. Everyone responded instantly to the new goal. The exhaustion was still present, but the prospect of a secure, heated base, powered by something other than their dwindling propane, was a potent motivator. The Wharton Consolidated School appeared like a looming concrete battleship against the white fields. It was a massive, two-story structure of brutalist, reinforced brick, squat and low, designed for utility over aesthetics. Its construction was exactly what we needed. Thick walls, small deep-set windows, and a foundation built to withstand the elements. Brody and Charles secured the building first. The main entrance doors were warped and frozen shut, but Charles located a service entrance in the back, near the boiler room, where a steel door had been forced open by the initial flooding and freeze. The interior was a world of frozen artifacts. Classrooms with desks askew, long-abandoned textbooks frozen to the floors, and long, dark hallways that stretched into chilling white silence. The building was immense, offering far more space than we needed, along with natural compartmentalization for defense and heating. The biggest discovery was the boiler room. Located in the basement, it was a cavernous space containing a decommissioned but potentially salvageable coal-fired furnace and a network of pipes that led to radiators throughout the building. Charles, his eyes shining with professional focus and excitement, was already following a thick, insulated conduit leading out the back wall toward a separate, smaller blockhouse 20 yards away, the coal generation station. It's separated from the main building, Charles noted, rubbing his hands together. Good. The coal dust won't contaminate the living quarters. The black gold. We moved into the school's gymnasium, a massive space that was cold but dry and easily insulated with our remaining sleeping bags and foam. Brody assigned the men to begin sealing the gymnasium doors and covering the large, shattered windows with salvaged plastic and thick blankets. The real work was now in the hands of the engineers, Brody and Charles. Their mission was simple: find coal and light the fire of civilization. The coal mine itself was 3/4 of a mile down the ravine, long dormant and choked with snow. Thankfully, the area was on even higher ground than the school. Brody deemed the main mine shaft too dangerous to enter, but the map indicated a surface storage shed. After a grueling hour of walking and digging through packed snow, they found it. A large concrete bunker with a collapsed roof, but its contents intact. Inside lay a mountain of black coal, the remnants of the mine's last year of operation, preserved perfectly by the freeze. It was hard, dense, high BTU fuel, enough to keep the school running for months, perhaps even years, if managed efficiently. Hauling enough coal back was a punishing task, taking up the rest of the next day. We all helped to pull large sleds we made for this purpose repeatedly, filling them with the heavy, jagged lumps of fuel. Exhaustion was a deep, aching certainty, but the psychological boost was immense. They had found renewable heat. The engine of hope. The final, most critical task fell to Charles. Brody assisted, using his general engineering knowledge and physical strength, but this was Charles's moment of mastery. The small blockhouse contained a single, massive generator engine and an antiquated system for feeding steam into the school's radiators. The system was rusty, coated in dust, and clearly hadn't run in decades. The good news is that old systems are often mechanical and require fewer microelectronics to run, Charles explained, his voice energized by the challenge. The bad news is that it's old, and everything is seized. For hours, operating solely by the light of a small, battery-powered lantern, Charles worked. He meticulously checked the boiler's pressure gauges, cleared the clogged intake valves, and used small amounts of scavenged diesel and high-proof alcohol to clean and lubricate the critical bearings. He found the main coal feed mechanism to the furnace jammed, and spent nearly an hour hammering it clear. Brody and Travis provided the physical muscle, turning seized valves and hauling away rusted components. I stood guard, occasionally passing tools and offering critical thermal checks, making sure neither man succumbed to the cold or exhaustion. The moment of truth came at 2 a.m. Charles had cleared the main furnace box, inspected the primary water lines, which miraculously had not burst, being heavy industrial steel, and manually forced the ventilation open. "We need a small, controlled fire in the furnace to check the airflow," Charles said, his face smeared with coal dust and grease. Brody lit a small fire using kindling and the precious diesel, feeding it with small lumps of coal. The airflow held. The furnace, ancient and stubborn, began to draw breath. Slowly, carefully, Charles began feeding the main system. The coal caught, roaring to life with a fierce, yellow-orange energy. The basement became instantly hot, the dry heat a sharp contrast to the biting chill of the school halls. We waited, huddled near the furnace, watching the pressure gauge on the ancient boiler. Slowly, painstakingly, the needle began to creep upward. Then a hiss. A loud, shuddering sound echoed through the school. the sound of steam racing through miles of frozen pipes. Then, a low clunk. In the gymnasium, where the 20 exhausted survivors slept, a single, battered fluorescent light above the basketball hoop flickered to life, bathing the room in a sickly yellow glow. Moments later, the radiators in the basement began to tick, then hiss, then radiate warmth. Charles threw his head back and let out a single, exhausted, triumphant yell that echoed through the empty school halls. "We have power! We have heat! We have coal!" Brody clapped Charles on the shoulder, a rare, genuine smile splitting his face. The tension that had defined him for weeks finally lifted. The light and heat rapidly spread through the main sections of the school. The survivors emerged from their thermal sleeping bags, their faces stunned, bathing in the glorious, limitless warmth and light we haven't seen in months. They had traded a 6-week propane timer for a renewable future. I walked to Brody, his face covered in soot and sweat, and pulled him down into a profound kiss that was hot with the smell of coal smoke and the victory of civilization. "Welcome home, Brody," I whispered. "Welcome to the future." The school was immense, sturdy, and now warm. We had found our fortress, our base for the Ice Age. The hard work was over. The long work had just begun. Chapter 9. The Living Engine. Securing the fortress, the triumph of lighting the coal furnace had granted us a single, vital currency: time. The immense, ancient boiler in the school's basement was a dry, powerful heart, thrumming with life. It meant we had traded a 6-week propane timer for the potential of months, perhaps years, of warmth. The initial euphoria, however, gave way immediately to the punishing labor of turning the sprawling, frozen Wharton-consolidated school into a defensible, habitable fortress. The immediate priority was to seal the structure. The heat generated by Charles's restored engine was expensive, and every shattered window and cracked doorframe was a debt paid in coal. Brody, now fully transitioned from navigation expert to command engineer, organized the teams with ruthless efficiency. The building was a labyrinth of cold, dark spaces. The gymnasium was our temporary hub, but the true prize was the adjacent 2-story classroom wing. Travis, Malika, and the younger, faster survivors were tasked with clearing the classrooms. We shoveled deep, frozen snowdrifts that had blown in through shattered windows, piled desks and chairs into enormous stacks for structural use, and scraped up layers of mold and debris. The air, once frigid, slowly began to thaw, filling the halls with the smell of wet plaster and old chalk dust, the scent of a world waking up. Charles, leveraging his electrical engineering background, directed teams to insulate and compartmentalize. We used the scavenged industrial plastic sheeting to create airtight, secondary walls, focusing the heat on the south-facing classrooms on the first floor. These rooms, adjacent to the main supply lines, were chosen for the barracks and the infirmary. I managed the insulation within the chosen spaces. We went out into nearby houses and scavenged for anything we could find to make our new home habitable. A small old hardware store proved valuable. We managed to get enough supplies to also repaint the walls and patch up the most immediate problem areas. I chose a classroom and slowly started turning it into my own personal space, and I wasn't the only one. The months of spending time in close proximity for warmth and survival had passed. We sought to individualize our own spaces. The sheer scale of the building necessitated specialization. We left the north wing to the absolute sterile cold, sealing off the hallways with double-layered plastic curtains and heavy, dead-bolted doors. The cold became an asset. The north wing became our massive, walk-in freezer, perfectly preserving all the scavenged food. Brody oversaw every structural integrity check. He and Jackson spent 2 days on the roof, risking life and limb on the slick, snow-covered surface to patch holes with salvaged metal sheeting and seal off non-essential vents. Every hour of effort pushed the collapse date of our food and fuel supply further into the future. The coal was infinite. The gas was insurance. The integrity of the school was paramount. One night, I was lying in bed, smelling clean from soap and my recently taken wash. The powering back of the school meant we could boil water, we could bathe. I ran a comb through my hair, which had turned into a greasy mess of tangles. It was funny how when you are in survival mode, cleanliness and beauty take a back burner. The fact that those things now have become relevant put a smile on my face. I crawled onto the mattress where Brody was lying, a hand behind his head as he looked at the ceiling. I looked at the boards from the desks, wondering how I could make some furniture out of them. Needless to say, I don't know how to make any, but the huge score from the hardware shop gave us enough supplies to try. I kissed him on the cheek and inhaled his clean smell mixed with the rose scent of the soap. "Penny, for your thoughts?" I asked him. He pulled me closer. "We need to get the plumbing done too," he said. I could see that was one important thing on his mental list. Plumbing and setting up a greenhouse. We had done a lot, but we still had so much more to do for our continued survival. Expanding the scavenge perimeter With the core of the school secured and radiating a comforting dry heat, the group began a new, more calculated phase of scavenging. Systematic resource extraction. Our goal was no longer immediate survival, but the inventory necessary to maintain a small society through a prolonged ice age. The focus shifted to the farms and houses further from our vicinity, which were now easily accessible on foot. The sleds, now lighter due to the fixed base, were used for hauling. The scavenging missions became regular, disciplined operations. Brody would not allow anyone outside the school walls if the temperature dropped below 10 degrees, if there was thick snowfall, or if the wind exceeded 10 knots. When we went out, we moved in teams of 5, heavily armed with crowbars to break through pesky ice barriers. Slowly, we started getting used to the reality that a majority of people were dead. The evidence of it was too stark in the frozen bodies we found in homes and vehicles. We targeted 2 types of resources. The first target was tools and hardware. Workshops, garages, and sheds yielded essential items like axes, snow shovels, heavy rope, chains, and durable metal storage containers. Charles found a basic arc welder in a collapsed barn, a discovery that electrified him with possibilities for repairing the ancient generator, which we found in one of the school storerooms. We also target long-term food stores. We searched root cellars, basements, and pantries in the well-built farmhouses on higher elevation that had drained completely, looking for dried goods, sealed preserves, and anything that wasn't water-based and hadn't burst during the flash freeze. The isolation remained profound. We traveled for miles, finding only the silent, frozen remnants of the lives that had died instantly. The sad part about the deaths we found was that they survived the floods, but the flash freeze killed them. The only tracks we saw were our own. The pervasive, echoing silence of the Ohio countryside was a constant psychological test. One afternoon, returning from a run with 2 full sleds of durable plastic pipe for the much-needed plumbing and various tools, Malika collapsed near the school entrance. "I can't take the quiet," she admitted to Travis, tears freezing instantly on her cheeks. "It's like the world is holding its breath forever." Travis, his face grimed with soot and sweat, pulled her into a hug. "We are the breath, Malika. We are the noise now. Just look at the smoke from the chimney. That's life." He pointed up, his optimism seeping in. Indeed, the thick black plume of coal smoke rising from the school's newly functional chimney was the only sign of industry for 50 miles, a defiant signal of life against the vast white canvas of the Ice Age. The smoke signal, it was 2 weeks since we had moved into the school. The main team was preparing for the largest scavenging run yet, planning to bring back lumber for interior structural work. I was in the kitchen, a former home economics classroom, supervising the preparation of the morning rations. The smell of pasta and canned soups mixed pleasantly with the dry, warm air radiating from the heavy iron radiators. Suddenly, a loud, frantic pounding echoed from the sealed, heavy steel door of the school's main entrance. The sound was alien, terrifying. The first genuine, foreign contact in weeks. The entire school froze. The noise had an immediacy, a desperation, that shattered our established sense of security. Brody, who was discussing the route with Charles, instantly snatched a fire axe he kept leaning against the wall. "Everyone to the barricaded windows. Stay silent," he commanded, his voice a tense whisper that crackled with renewed military precision. He, Charles, and Travis moved stealthily toward the main entrance hallway, which was still cold and dark. I followed, carrying the pistol Brody had entrusted to me, my heart hammering against my ribs. I've never fired the thing. He had placed it in my backpack before we left New York, and I recently started carrying it during scavenge hunts. Brody pressed his ear against the cold steel of the heavy main door, then slowly cracked open the narrow peep slot he had cut into the wood frame. He stared for a long, silent moment, his body rigid. Then, slowly, cautiously, he lowered the axe. "It's an old man," Brody murmured, his voice laced with absolute disbelief. "And a running truck." He addressed the door, his voice muffled. "Who are you? And how did you get here?" A rough, weathered voice, thick with rural drawl and exhaustion, responded. "Name's Elmer, son. Saw your smoke 2 days back on the edge of the horizon. Figured if anyone was crazy enough to fire up the old Wharton mine, they'd be worth checking on. I need warm shelter for my kin. Let me in before the cold takes me." Brody looked at us all, a silent, complex negotiation passing between us. A single desperate man was one thing. A signal flare visible for miles was another. But the mention of the truck, a working vehicle, was a prize we couldn't ignore. Brody slid the deadbolt. The heavy door groaned, and a blast of frigid air rushed into the hall. Standing on the step was an old man, bundled in thick, heavy canvas and wool, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, dusted white with frost. Behind him, parked clumsily on the snow-packed driveway, was a battered, enormous old-model pickup truck, its tires fitted with thick, homemade chains, its engine idling, puffing white clouds of exhaust into the sky. Elmer's reality, Elmer was immediately ushered into the gymnasium, the sudden overwhelming warmth causing him to gasp and shed tears. While Malika and Sarah administered warm water and checked him for frostbite, Brody drilled him with sharp, rapid questions. Elmer's story was one of incredible foresight and sheer rural tenacity. When the water started rising, I knew the city slickers were cooked, and the people up top had lost control of the situation, Elmer rasped, warming his hands aggressively near the propane heater. But the soil here is sponge. The water went down fast, and what didn't go down had pulled back to the coasts. I figured the next thing would be the freeze. I knew things would get worse. I didn't need a weather engineer telling me that. He explained that immediately after the flash flood, he and his wife, Martha, and 3 grandkids had spent 3 days moving everything from their farm, feed, fuel, tools, and the livestock into their massive, heavily built barn, insulating it with straw and thick plastic sheeting. We heard the warnings on the radio before the broadcast died, Elmer explained. The snow came fast, but we were sealed tight. Used my tractor fuel to run a little stove and keep the pump going. We didn't freeze, but we were running low on feed for the livestock. Brody's eyes fixed on the man's every word. The key revelation wasn't just survival, but the livestock. Livestock? Brody repeated, his voice low with disbelief and awe. You have animals? What kind? Cows, goats, a couple hogs, and a dozen chickens, Elmer said proudly. They're tough breeds. They're what kept Martha and the grandkids sane. We got the truck running off a mixture of diesel and heating oil, had to cannibalize the old tractor, but she moves. Elmer's arrival didn't just bring people. It brought infrastructure and renewable food. Brody immediately recognized the significance. Cows meant milk and hides, goats meant more milk and fiber, chickens meant eggs. It was the biological foundation for a community. The decision was instant. Elmer, Martha, your grandchildren, you are welcome here if you want to join us. We have warmth, space, security, and coal for years. But your animals are our lifeblood. We need them here too. Brody made the offer, his eyes fixed on the man's face. Elmer agreed instantly. I saw the smoke, son. I figured anyone running a coal plant in this mess wasn't stupid. We'll bring the herd over at first light tomorrow. It's too cold to move them now. The new colony. The news electrified us. The arrival of Martha, Elmer's wife, and their 3 grandchildren, 19-year-old Alice, 12-year-old Sam, and 8-year-old Cora, would bring the total population of the Wharton School colony to 28. More importantly, the arrival of livestock meant the possibility of a return to a pre-industrial caloric diet: meat, dairy, and eggs. The rest of the day was spent in frenetic preparation. The truck, which Elmer confirmed was still functional, was parked safely inside the gymnasium entrance. Brody and Charles immediately began studying its structure, dreaming of using it to haul massive amounts of timber or coal. I worked with Malika, Sarah, and the 6 other women from our original group, preparing the space for the animals. Brody decided against housing them in the main school complex due to sanitation and noise. We need a dedicated area, easy to clean and structurally separate, Brody explained. He consulted the building schematics. The old art and shop wing. It's concrete, has large floor drains for cleaning, and is far enough from the main classrooms to contain the smell and disease. The wing, a cold, dimly lit space, was quickly cleared. The men used scavenged lumber to build simple stalls for the goats, pigs, and cows, hauling massive amounts of hay, found in a nearby barn, to provide bedding and insulation. The chickens were given a cozier home. The science lab, with its sturdy tables, sinks, and smaller contained space, was designated the poultry room. The benches were cleared, and nesting boxes were constructed from wooden crates. That night, for the first time since leaving New York, we had a small, raw taste of true abundance. Elmer had brought a jar of pickled eggs and a container of frozen, cured ham, a celebratory feast that provided a psychological boost that MREs never could. I found Brody and Charles in the basement, meticulously cleaning the tools that would be used the next morning to secure the livestock. We went from 4 months of gas to 4 years of coal, Charles said, smiling broadly, covered in sweat and grease. And now, we have the means to generate our own protein and fiber. Elmer's truck is tough, but it's essential for long-range scavenging. Brody nodded, wiping diesel from his hands. He's a man who planned for the world, not just a city. We integrate him, we utilize his experience, and we grow the colony. Chapter 10. The Engine of Civilization. I was in the newly set-up hospital room, working next to Martha, who I found out used to be an ER nurse. We were arranging the bag of meds that the scavenging team brought in when Kyle walks in, limping and flinching. But his face was flushed with the cold from outside and excitement. Though his leg was still healing, his mind was restless. After days of studying the blueprints and the school's exterior, he cracked the water problem. This school ran on a borehole, Kyle announced, his voice tight with professional excitement. It's too deep to be city water. That water source is deep enough to be beneath the frost line. The water's still flowing down there," he announced to Martha and me as he settled on the bench, which we moved from the school nurse room. I start to look at his foot that he spent too much time on today. "You've been doing too much with your foot, Kyle," I told him, unimpressed. "Yes, I have. But did you hear what I said? About the water?" The school had been out of function long before the reset. The well had been dry, so there was no water in the pipes, and they are intact. All the pump needs is a little TLC, and we'll be back in business. Think of it, Jade. Working toilets, we don't have to take a shit in the snow anymore, and actual hot showers. His excitement is palpable, and I wrap his leg in a brace as I hand him some pain meds. That sounds great too. Anything but the shitting in the snow. What do Brody and Charles say? I ask him. He shrugs. They aren't here. Have been busy with scavenging. We need to get on with the greenhouse. I nod to him in agreement. The last time I saw Brody was this morning, when they were bringing in feed and hay for the animals. We decided not to eat any of them until we have expanded their numbers. Elmer's advice has been invaluable, and more people in our group are taking interest in the animal care. The fact that the 3 goats and 1 cow give us milk daily helps. Later that day, when Kyle announces the big news to Brody and Charles, they immediately recognize the profound implication: a limitless supply of clear, liquid water. The challenge was immediate. The pipes connecting the borehole to the school's massive water tank, located in the freezing attic, were certainly ruptured due to weathering. The ensuing labor was punishing. It took 2 full days of grueling, back-breaking work in the deep cold. Brody, Charles, and a rotating team of men dug a trench 300 yards across the packed snow and shallow frozen ground, hauling out the old fractured copper lines and replacing them with thick, industrial plastic piping scavenged from a local irrigation supplier. Every swing of the pickaxe against the frozen earth was a battle. Martha kept a constant eye on the men to ensure none of them got frostbite. Their muscles screamed, their breath froze on their beards, but the knowledge that they were digging for water, for life, drove them on. While the men dug, Malika, Sarah, and I coordinated the thermal protection for the attic tank. We hauled every spare piece of insulation, foam, and textile up 3 flights of freezing stairs, wrapping the massive steel cistern in a dense thermal blanket and rigging a heated pipe loop from the main boiler to prevent the liquid water from refreezing once it reached the school. It was an exercise in pure logistics, transforming raw scavenged materials into a complex, functioning system. The moment of success was intoxicating. Charles flipped the pump switch, and after a minute of low, worrying silence, a sudden, resounding gurgle echoed from the attic. 10 minutes later, a tap in the old cafeteria kitchen sputtered, coughed out brown sediment, and then erupted in a powerful, steady stream of cold, clear liquid water. We had running water. The immediate psychological shift was immense. The grime of the journey was finally washed away. Kyle set up a simple gravity-fed shower using the hot steam pipe runoff in the basement, allowing everyone the luxury of a full wash for the first time in months. The feeling of the hot water sluicing away the layers of dirt and stress was a profound moment of returning human dignity, something the water bucket and soap failed to achieve. The second phase of plumbing began instantly. Charles and Kyle collaborated, rigging up rudimentary water lines to the classrooms. We scavenged old toilets and sinks from abandoned houses and, using the industrial plastic piping, began constructing simple, private toilet/wash basin systems within small partitions built in our classrooms. This simple addition elevated our lives from a refugee camp to a permanent settlement. The call of the soil, building the greenhouse. With warmth and water secured, our collective gaze turned to the soil. The coal engine meant we had the energy to build the ultimate long-term asset, a greenhouse. Brody designed the structure to attach directly to the south face of the school, utilizing the building's waste heat and power for lighting. The first task was symbolic and grueling, breaking through the ice to access the frozen earth. A task that seemed almost impossible. The ground was covered in heavy snow, and beneath that lay a foot of solid ice, a brittle, challenging barrier. The men systematically cracked the ice layer over the chosen greenhouse footprint. The 3 jackhammers we had came in very handy with breaking the ice. The noise was a strange break from the quiet calm we got used to. The heavy, rhythmic crack of the ice breaking was a profound sound of conquest. The true victory was the sight of the dark, frozen Ohio soil beneath the ice. We gathered handfuls of the rich, dark dirt, our hands numb with cold, feeling the tangible reality of our future. We had reached the promised ground. The search for building materials had then intensified, shifting our scavenging from food to glass and clear plastic. Elmer's truck, after Charles had stabilized its engine, was crucial for hauling the heavy, fragile materials. We raided the large, abandoned farmhouses and commercial greenhouses, finding enough old storm windows, thick glass panes, and industrial plastic sheeting to begin constructing the large, angled walls of the structure. Brody's design was clever, maximizing solar gain and minimizing heat loss, promising to create a warm pocket of spring in the middle of the ice age. Every night I would crawl into bed next to Brody, extremely tired but very satisfied with how my life was now. The beacon burns bright, new faces. Life in the school settled into a robust, disciplined routine. The kitchen ran smoothly, the perimeter was regularly checked, and the generators hummed steadily. The smoke plume from the coal furnace, however, was a bright, black beacon, visible for 50 miles. It was a cold, clear afternoon, 3 weeks after the engine was started. I was helping Malika stack newly scrubbed dishes in the kitchen when the alarm, a heavy iron triangle Charles had rigged near the entrance, rang out, loud and urgent. Brody and Travis, who were working on a radio Travis found, instantly moved to the entrance, fire axes in hand. The isolation was over. Brody peered through the peep slot, then slowly cracked the door open. Standing outside were 2 figures, a young woman, maybe 20, supporting an older man, perhaps 60, who was leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane. They were exhausted, frost-rimed, and their eyes were wide with a desperate, crushing hope. "We saw the smoke," the young woman gasped, her voice raw. "We've been walking for 5 days. Please. We need shelter." The negotiation was brief and entirely necessary. Brody confirmed their isolation and accepted them inside. Our numbers were growing. This first wave of new arrivals, 33 people strong now, was followed by others over the next week. A solitary, thin man who introduced himself as a former high school teacher. He had walked over 100 miles and was nearly dead from exposure. A young couple who had survived in a frozen camper trailer for a month, bringing with them a small cache of medical supplies and tools. Another older man, a former machinist, who had sheltered alone in a frozen workshop, arriving in a modified snowmobile, which Charles immediately began dismantling for parts and fuel. The vetting process was quick and brutal. Brody's criteria were simple. Are you a threat? Are you useful? Their resources were pooled, their stories were checked against the cold reality of the dead world they had walked through, and they were assigned immediate tasks. The work to rebuild our community was in full swing, and we needed the hands that came in. The former high school teacher, once well enough, immediately took over education, organizing the scavenged textbooks and setting up classes for the children. The mechanic was put to work with Charles, the synergy between the 2 engineers quickly improving the coal engine's efficiency. The new arrivals, desperate for warmth and purpose, worked with a fierce, grateful intensity. The colony was growing, expanding and consolidating. We had secured warmth, water, light, labor, and food security. The hard work of building the greenhouse was no longer a question of if, but of how quickly we could finish. The future, though cold, was now a tangible reality we were actively building. The school, once a silent monument to the past, was now a loud, bustling center of life and industry, its smoke rising defiantly into the silent, frozen sky. "We need a large perimeter wall around this place. We can't just let anyone wander to our front door. It's dangerous," Brody murmured in my hair as our bodies cooled down from our latest bout of lovemaking. My body, drowsy and satisfied, hummed. "What do you suggest?" Travis said they found a couple of snowplows down at the old fire stations. "We will bring them in soon. Charles is going to see if he can get the fuel tank we found and bring it in. Then Travis, Jackson, and Todd will be in charge of the perimeter wall." "You think that's enough?" I ask him. 3 people don't feel enough. He shrugs. "That's what we can spare now. The work for the greenhouse is more urgent," he says. "The walls are coming in well, and soon the roofing will be next." I'm standing in line for the breakfast and take a seat, looking at my steaming hot oats and melting butter on top. Malika takes a seat opposite me. "Hey, good morning," I tell her. She gives me a tight smile and leans in. "I need your help after breakfast," she says. I nod, realizing the urgency of the matter from her eyes. Malika is not one who usually asks for help. We enter the infirmary, and she looks around before she says, "I need you to check if I'm pregnant," she says. I raise my brow and smile. "Of course. Have you been feeling anything off?" I ask her as she lays down on the bed. "I've not had my period since the reset. I thought it was because of everything that happened, but now we've settled in, and still nothing. I always want to cry, and Travis has been annoying me more than usual, but when he is gone, I miss him," she says, tears rushing to her eyes. I raise her shirt and warm my hands on the small heater, and notice there is a slight bump on her lower stomach. "How long has this been here?" I ask her, and she shrugs. "I don't know. I thought it was gas." I gently touch the sides and confirm her words. "Well, congratulations, Mama. You are pregnant," I tell her, a large smile on my face, then it falls. "What is it?" I ask her. More tears fall from her eye, and she shakes her head. "This is not a good time," she says, getting up. "Hey, the time is all right," I tell her gently. She shakes her head again. "You think?" I nod. "Yes. Look at everything we have now. The baby will be fine," I assure her. But slight doubt creeps in, because her pregnancy has highlighted our lack of adequate equipment. But my words bring a light to her eyes. Later on, I hear a hoot of excitement from Travis after she tells him about their baby. Chapter 11. The Garden and the Wall. The defiant perimeter. The Wharton Consolidated School, now a beacon of defiant warmth in the frozen Ohio landscape, transitioned into a frenzy of construction. The immediate focus remained the two pillars of long-term survival: security and sustenance. Brody, now leading a skilled, specialized workforce of 33, divided the labor with the efficiency of a general manager. Brody, Charles, and Kyle remained dedicated to the greenhouse project. The rest of the able-bodied men, led by Travis, Jackson, and Todd, were tasked with the daunting physical labor of building the perimeter wall. Travis, energized by the news of Malika's pregnancy, attacked the perimeter project with a fierce, almost manic enthusiasm. He no longer saw himself as a reluctant survivalist, but as a father protecting his lineage. His team used the two scavenged snowplows, modified by Charles, to push and compress massive snowdrifts around the schoolyard, forming the core of the defense. Their true genius, however, was in the material. The vast, flat surface of the schoolyard was covered in shallow, frozen floodwater. Travis directed his men to cut huge, uniform blocks of the surface ice, using heavy saws and crowbars. These transparent, blue-gray blocks were hauled and stacked onto the compacted snow berms, creating a thick, high wall of pure, solid ice around the entire school perimeter. The sheer volume of ice required was immense, a tribute to the team's punishing, round-the-clock labor. The fuel truck that was hauled in weeks ago proved to be a valuable resource once the diesel was warmed to normal operating temperatures, providing consistent fuel for the snowplows. The ice wall rose 10 feet high, stretching the full circumference of the schoolyard. It was a massive, daunting structure that shimmered faintly in the weak sunlight. It was not merely a physical barrier, it was a psychological one, declaring to the dead world that the Wharton colony was protected, permanent, and willing to defend itself. The architecture of spring. While the perimeter hardened, the south face of the school became the site of the greenhouse project. This was the colony's heart, the architecture of their future. Brody, Charles, and the machinist, now collectively known as the Engineers Guild, worked with meticulous dedication. They used the scavenged lumber to build the heavy, angled skeletal frame, bolting it directly to the sturdy brick foundation of the school. The entire structure was then wrapped in layers of thick, clear plastic sheeting and covered with the scavenged window panes and storm windows, creating a massive, transparent shield designed to trap every BTU of heat. Inside the evolving structure, the sound of the jackhammers was replaced by the low, steady thump of shovels. The men, working in shifts, cleared the remaining ice and snow from the floor and began mixing the precious, thawed Ohio soil with organic matter and animal waste sourced from Elmer's Artwing barn. The final connection was the most critical. The engineers rigged an intricate system of pipes directing the waste heat from the main coal boiler, hot air and steam, through coils beneath the greenhouse floor. This established a critical thermal baseline, ensuring the soil itself remained warm enough to support life, even while the outside world hovered below freezing. The moment the last piece of plastic was sealed, the greenhouse transformed. It became a pocket of perpetual spring. Inside, the temperature soared to a constant 65 degrees. On good days, when sunlight broke through for a few minutes, it streamed through the glass, warming the damp, rich earth. The air was thick, humid, and smelled powerfully of thawing soil and possibility, a profound, almost intoxicating contrast to the sterile, frigid air outside. With the foundation for the greenhouse set, my days, which I had spent reading on how to grow plants, came to be tested as I, Martha, Elmer's wife, whose experience was invaluable, and Malika, whose condition required careful light work, took charge of the planting, accompanied by many others in the colony. With the utmost care, we broke open Brody's sealed bags of seeds, precious tomatoes, sturdy root vegetables, and leafy greens. We placed the tiny seeds in the dark, warm soil, completing the biological circuit. The wait was agonizing, but within days, the first vibrant green shoots pushed through the earth. The sight was met with stunned, silent reverence by the entire colony. It was tangible proof that our suffering had not been in vain. We had forced life back into a dead world. The first harvest and exponential growth. The success of the greenhouse was astonishing. Fueled by constant warmth, artificial lighting from the coal engine, and the dense organic matter from Elmer's livestock, the seeds exploded into life. The days were long, but the work was shared, tending the vulnerable plants with a love born of desperation. 3 weeks after planting, the first harvest began. It was a day of profound celebration. We gathered vast quantities of crisp lettuce, vibrant green spinach, and the first sweet earthy radishes. That night, the community feast was unlike any other. We didn't just eat, we reveled in the taste of the future. The thin, watery MRE soup was replaced by thick, hearty vegetable stews, enriched by goat's milk and seasoned with fresh herbs we had planted. The shift was immediate and profound. The group moved from subsisting on rationed, preserved military calories and random scavenged food to thriving on fresh, nutrient-rich food. The improved diet instantly bolstered morale, health, and energy, accelerating all other work. The success of the greenhouse was a turning point for security as well. The smoke was still our beacon, and the increased stability meant the trickle of survivors seeking refuge intensified. By the time of the first major harvest, the colony population had swelled to nearly 100 people. The vetting process was now stricter, but the framework held. New arrivals, desperate for shelter, quickly surrendered their resources and skills for entry. Brody, relying heavily on Charles's technical assessment and Elmer's practical judgment, integrated them efficiently. A former construction foreman took over managing the ice wall and structural maintenance. A veterinarian immediately joined Elmer in the art wing, ensuring the health of the livestock. 2 former teachers expanded the education wing for the rapidly increasing number of children. The 2 children we started our journey with had expanded to 16 children of various ages. The Wharton colony had successfully passed from survival mode to societal establishment. The quiet hope and the search for voice. While the physical work solidified our existence, Travis pursued a different, crucial kind of project: connection. He had managed to salvage and repair a powerful shortwave radio, a complex, static-filled machine he nicknamed the Oracle. Every night, after the exhausting work of the wall, Travis would settle into a sealed room in the library wing, tuning the machine. He was searching for a voice, a sign that civilization existed beyond our small, isolated schoolhouse. Night after night, he was met only by static and the dead whisper of the Ice Age. The failure was a silent burden he carried alone. He searched the emergency frequencies, the military bands, and the ham radio loops, but the airwaves were silent, confirming Brody's worst fear: civilization as we knew it was gone. Yet Travis never missed a night. He saw the radio not as a tool of communication, but as an act of hope. As long as he was tuning, we weren't entirely alone. The new generation, the ultimate affirmation of the colony's victory, came on a blindingly cold day, in the depths of the Ice Age. Malika's labor began suddenly and intensely. I was with her instantly, alongside Martha, whose experience was invaluable. The infirmary, which now boasted an ultrasound machine Travis and Brody had scavenged from a hospital months earlier, was transformed into a sterile, warm delivery room. The tension in the school was palpable. Outside, the ice wall stood silent, protecting the colony. Inside, the ancient generator hummed steadily, fueling the lights and the warmth that protected this moment. The birth was long, difficult, and messy, a visceral reminder of life's painful, raw beauty. Travis was nervously by Malika's side, giving her words of encouragement. Underneath his encouragement, he was frantic and helpless, grappling with the ancient anxiety of fatherhood. Finally, after hours of agonizing effort, a cry, loud, vigorous, and utterly undeniable, echoed through the radiator pipes of the Wharton School. It was a boy, the first baby born into the Ice Age colony. I emerged, exhausted but exhilarated, to find Brody leaning against the barracks doorway, covered in sweat despite the cold air. "She's fine, Brody," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "They're both fine. You have a nephew. Travis wants you to come and meet him." Brody staggered into the infirmary. The sight of Malika, exhausted but radiant, holding a small, red, perfect bundle of humanity was the definitive moment of the apocalypse. It was the moment where survival became triumph. I stood at the window of the infirmary, looking out at the shimmering ice wall, then back at the soft glow of the classroom, hearing the cries of the new baby, the sound of the future. The simple fact of a new life, born into the greatest darkness the world had ever known, was an overwhelming, powerful source of energy. I walked back to the small group, Travis, who was kissing Malika's forehead, his own face wet with tears. He looked up at me, his storm-gray eyes shining with a profound, peaceful certainty. "We did it, Jade," he whispered. "We made it to the future." I smiled, and looked at Brody, who drew me closer to him, my body aching but my heart full. We had heat, we had water, we had a wall, we had food, and now, we had a child. The Ice Age was raging outside, but inside the walls of the Wharton Consolidated School, spring had begun. The long trek is over. The 500-mile walk ends here, as the Wharton colony successfully secured its future against the Ice Age. With the first baby born and the greenhouse thriving, the triumph of Brody, Jade, and the survivors is complete. Thank you so much for joining us for the full saga of survival and hope. If you were inspired by their journey, please Please like this video and leave a comment about your favorite moment of their victory. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support more stories like this one.